Hi everyone, welcome to today's session at the Academy. Today we're going to talk a little bit about corporate incubation. I'm being joined by Daniel Kellmereit, who is joining us from Detecon Consulting, one of our partners, from San Francisco. Detecon Consulting, many of you might not know, but it's actually a daughter company of Deutsche Telekom Group. They are traditionally a management consulting company, but they also specialize in innovation and specifically incubation practices within corporates. So I'd like to welcome you, Daniel, to the call. Thanks for joining us. Maybe you can give us a quick, brief introduction of yourself and your role there at Detecon.
Great. Thanks, Jan, for having me. Hi, everybody from San Francisco. Yeah, my name is Daniel. I'm working with Detecon, as Jan already mentioned. We're part of the consulting group, the global Deutsche Telekom consulting group. And my team here works a lot around innovation management. So we help mostly actually large corporates to define methods, tools, and approaches to become more innovative. And specifically in that regard, to also learn from startups. There's a number of things to be learned on how to build and how to scale companies. And there's a lot of science now actually developed behind that, and we're trying to make it available to corporates.
All right, brilliant. So I think this is going to be a very hot topic today because everyone is talking about incubation. So let's define incubation. What do you think is corporate incubation?
Yeah, what is it? Basically, it's a big buzzword, right? It came up a couple of years ago. We did have incubators in the year 2000. I think most people know that these ones famously kind of flamed out, and people couldn't use the word anymore for a number of years. So to incubate was kind of a word that was kind of not used in business in the year 2002, 3, 4, 5. So it's interesting how that now came back, but I think there's reasons for it to come back. I think the big topic that kind of is connected to it is that it's just become, especially in the technology space, very, very cheap to build products. And I myself can say that I had a company in 2000 and we built a technology which was fairly expensive to build. So doing the same, I won't mention the numbers, but doing the same and building the same application today, you could basically save 90 to 95% of the cost. What does that mean for companies working in tech? That means that building the technology itself is not the core barrier to entry. The core barrier to entry is basically finding the right mentors, finding the right platforms that scale, and finding the right environment, right? And that's why you now basically have a super low threshold in terms of market entry, but you need a lot of kind of support in terms of things that you don't want to focus on. Finance, infrastructure, ideation process, all that I think you want to have from an outsourced provider or in a very convenient way, so you can really focus on scaling, because that's the core that's important. And I think that's why incubation has become so important, and that's why corporates are looking into that now as well as a potential way to kind of improve their product roadmap.
Okay, so incubation is becoming more and more a game. But before we go too much further, I think I just want to define the way we view the innovation process. A lot of our viewers will know, but the first phase is ideation. The second phase is then validating that idea before deciding to invest more resources in, and then going to an incubation phase, where we believe the goal of incubation is really to find product market fit, that you're figuring out the right way to deliver your value proposition to the market. That's how we then view the goal of incubation. Is that in line with your thinking?
I would say that's the core, and if you look at the way that large corporates do that today, I think you can very clearly see that many of them still work the old way. I mean, people start using Scrum, using agile technologies, but I think if you compare that specifically to like the leading companies and startups here in the Bay Area, it's obvious that this is a very new concept to corporates, and versus here in the Silicon Valley, you wouldn't get funding anymore if you kind of apply to these core principles. So I think it is very relevant, but it hasn't really been adopted by large corporates on a large scale. It's mostly done through external suppliers that kind of involve them a little bit, but it's definitely not part of the core DNA of large corporates today.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that a little bit. Maybe you can give us a bit of a taste for why corporates are now beginning to use incubators in particular, and maybe if you could elaborate on a few success stories that you've seen that show incubators inside corporates can work.
Yeah, happy to do that. Actually, it's still in a nascent stage, to be honest. I think a couple of the kind of independent incubators have shown some success. I think the rest of the companies, the jury's still out there if they're going to be and which ones are going to be the most successful ones. But I think why companies do this is predominantly because of having access to ideas from the outside. I mean, there's a number of trends around open innovation, around kind of leveraging what is out there beyond what you have in terms of talent and ideas in-house. So I think the idea to get outside ideas into the company is a core one. The second one that's very important is access to talent. So you are actually now able to not only get ideas, but you get the person attached to it, the person that has a motivation to drive that business, the person that maybe even has the passion to change something in that area. And these people usually tend to be very driven people and very qualified people. So for corporates, this is an excellent pool of talent they could potentially tap in. The third one we see is the idea of a positive brand image. Some companies do it also because it's something that's very attractive to the outside world, both in terms of the way you can present your brand, but also the way you can present yourself towards future employees and high potential employees. And the last one, which is maybe now more of a business impact point, is lower investment risks, right? Because in the end, if you look at what corporates today invest into incubation, it's a super small fraction of what they usually invest in innovation today, where they really invest high sums into sometimes very old and legacy business models. The amount and the amount of budget they invest here to get potential new ventures up and running is very, very small. So it's a low investment vehicle for them to test out.
Okay, good points, Daniel. I wasn't going to bring this up until a little bit later in the call, but I think you've just touched on it, so I need to address it now.
Absolutely.
The 3 points or 4 points you mentioned, bringing in ideas from the outside, access to talent, generating a positive brand image, and maybe using incubation as a low-risk investment strategy. These points all sound very much like outside-in strategies, whereas at the Academy, we're very much focused on also training the entrepreneur, right? So have you seen many examples of incubation being used for the employees rather than only looking at what startups are outside and trying to suck them into the corporate?
Yeah, I think this is, it's basically happening now as we speak. So we see the first ideas of companies that try to implement these kind of methodologies that are kind of used here in the Valley to build up and scale businesses, to use these ones and also build ventures or build new ventures around that. But it's at least from what we see for now, it's a very kind of early stage process, and I think because of a couple of the success stories that you have here in the Bay Area around startups, you will see much more of that going forward in companies, specifically in companies that have a strong technology focus.
Do you believe there will be a future army of entrepreneurs inside of big corporates? Will entrepreneur and the entrepreneur director become kind of new positions that are taken up by people?
I guess you will see that, yeah. I think it'll be different from company to company. I think you'll have some companies that will not see the need to innovate, that have a very stable, reliable cash flow business that is not disrupted by maybe digital and technologies. And I think there you just won't see it. I mean, there's going to be a low investment risk. They're going to secure the business as good as they can. There's going to be very different means. But I think wherever you have a business that is attacked by digital and by digital transformation, you will actually see that, right? You see it now in the financial tech area, which is maybe the most hyped one today. You saw it in the media space in the last 1 or 2 years. TV, you saw it in newspapers even earlier. You saw it in music maybe was the first one that's disrupted. So any product and business model which you can heavily disrupt by digitalizing it, I think will need to be changed. And I think what corporates will do there, and that's what we already see today, is that they very aggressively look into new ways of working and collaborating. And I think these companies will most likely adopt a large amount of entrepreneurial processes and entrepreneurial talent, and will run the company actually more maybe like a mini startup ecosystem, I would say.
Right. Would you be able to give us any names of companies that you think are adopting these practices particularly well?
So that's a difficult one. Yeah, it's very early right now, right? There's a number of initiatives that have been started. There's a couple now which are already ramping down again because maybe they had a too large investment in that space and had high expectations. Yeah, the jury is still out. I would argue that that a couple brands do some good jobs. So specifically in the media space, I think are a couple of interesting ones. Even in Germany, actually, if you look at the Axel Springer venture group and what they do, I think they're fairly innovative. And I think the way that they drive their digitalization of the group, I think is pretty much highly successful right now and could be considered a role model of how you do that and how you kind of digitalize your business model. And coming from the publishing industry, obviously they have that urgent need to actually do that, and they do that very successfully. Here in the Bay Area, GE has an incubator that focuses on the Internet of Things. What I like about GE is that they have a mid to long-term roadmap. So if you do incubation, you will have the same market dynamics that you currently have in the venture capital space. So you will invest in something, you'll scale it, and maybe in 7 to 10 years, you'll see a potential result or a major exit. But this will take time, right? And I think what GE does there, they go in with a pretty long-term planning horizon, and that's something I think which many corporates today underestimate. They won't return after 1 year. Not going to happen, right? I mean, if you look at the market, look at how it works, you build up a portfolio, you invest for 2-3 years, then you do follow-up financing for another 2-3 years, then you're in year number 6 maybe, and then you start seeing the first exits, maybe one after 2-3 years, but the majority of the impact on a corporate will be after 7 to 10 years. So you have to have the governance structure and everything in place to be able to actually maintain that, especially if you have management changes.
Mm. I think talking about the time frame here is quite interesting. You're mentioning exits, right?
Yeah.
But maybe that's a little bit unfair because I don't think the goal of incubation is always to get an exit, right? It could be to launch new products into the marketplace. That can happen a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
Even maybe to test out new processes that are more efficiency driven and designed to save money.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's definitely some soft factors which have to be calculated as well, and I was speaking very much in the classic venture capitalist wording here in terms of exit. I think there's a lot of soft benefits to a corporate, but I also feel that if you have a corporate incubation initiative and you give these corporate startups basically a potential exit channel into the group. Imagine there's a big corporate and there's a little super smart team starting, and then after 7 to 10 years they get bought by 100 million. This will create a huge impact on the startup ecosystem because then instantly that kind of large corporate is seen as a potential exit channel, and you have a best practice, and that draws talent. So I think the idea of exit is very attractive, and I would argue that if a corporate can show one large exit, the whole engine will kind of start running itself to some extent. But you're totally right. There's a number of soft factors in terms of just improving corporate agility, improving processes that also need to be taken into consideration.
After I met you last time in San Francisco, I spent some time in the Valley, and in Mountain View I met Samsung's Innovation Center. And I thought their strategy was quite interesting. They are very much looking at external entrepreneurs to bring in, but not necessarily their business. They want the skill set of the entrepreneur, and they're actually targeting the serial entrepreneur, the guy that's been around Silicon Valley for a while, and he's maybe made a few exits, had a few successes. But Samsung are offering this entrepreneur an internal exit. right? That if he designs and develops something that can be used on the Samsung platform, it's going to go out to a lot of people. It's going to have wide reach. And Samsung are basically playing on the entrepreneur's ego, right? That is, this guy wants to get his product out on as many devices as possible. Yeah. So they're actually looking for the more experienced person to come in and then utilize their skill set to benefit Samsung in the long run.
I think a very interesting approach, if you want me to comment on that, I think definitely an interesting approach. I think the more, and I've been discussing that with a couple of people in the last month actually, the more kind of senior talent you can get in of companies or startup CEOs or CTOs that have done it a couple of times, the better. Because if you kind of only attract people fresh from university and then try to build this mentoring network and everything else, it can become very, 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 very difficult. One issue obviously is if you're Samsung now, what if your platform is not as powerful anymore in a couple of years, right? So I think there needs to be a certain amount of support in terms of bringing yourself into the ecosystem, but there needs to be definitely the openness of also innovating outside. I think as soon as you restrict the startup to only innovate against the corporate roadmap, the market becomes small. You have certain dependencies which you maybe not want to have. So I think that's the corporate can be your most important customer, but it should never be your only one.
Right, that's a good point. You mentioned support there. Let's talk about this a little bit, because earlier I think you were approaching on the topic of mentorship, that's kind of an important requirement for incubation. How important is it to involve external and internal mentors when people or teams are going through this process?
Yeah, I think it is super important, and it is super difficult to achieve. I think mentors, to some regard, can be the core channel that's making the core decisions. It helps making core decisions around the product, around scaling it, around finding the right technical talent or the right CFO or the right chief marketing officer. So I think it is very important to get these mentors, and it is actually difficult to find them, right? I mean, in the Bay Area, we're lucky enough to have a reasonable amount of people who, even who had many exits, who just do it because they love working with startups. In some regions of the world, that is more difficult. So you want to be able to find good mentors. I think they should be, as you mentioned, a blend between people from the inside and people from the outside. And then with people from the inside, you want to find the right kind of mechanisms on how to incentivize them. So either you tie it into their goals, or there's even a monetary kind of incentive that needs to be there, in my opinion, to kind of attract good talent.
Okay. So we've been talking in general about incubation, and I think it's very clear now that incubation, the process of incubation at least, can be very different from company to company, depending on what the goals are, right? You've got outside versus inside the organization. You've got the topic of mentoring. You've got the time frame topic. What are you striving for? And even the types of innovation that you're approaching. So how does Detecon go about consulting clients on what sort of innovation or what sort of incubation practices to use?
Yeah, so we go in actually fairly open, because it really depends on your company goals. So usually we would look at the strategy of the company. We would look at the amount of risk actually they are willing to take, and they should take, right? Many of them are publicly listed, so you can pretty much say this is actually a cash flow business, and they do some little incremental innovations, but they don't have to radically change anything. The financial markets don't want to see radical change. They would value you differently if they see that risk, right? So you got to really figure out where the company is, what potential disruptions will come in the near future, and what the level of risk is. And I think based on these three factors, you then kind of design your innovation or incubation strategy. And that can be very, very different, right? For some, it can be only to kind of have a little pool of outside ideas that prepares you, or even that works against your existing roadmap. And for some, it's like we have to fundamentally change things that we do, and then it's gonna look very different. So we look at the business, we look at the risk the business is willing to take and can take, and then we kind of build the incubation strategy on top of that.
Okay, so let's imagine we have decided that we want to do an incubation strategy. I know you guys recently released a quite in-depth blog post about some of the common mistakes of poorly designed incubators. So that can actually lead to a big waste of money and resources. So what are some of the things that we need to look out for when designing our incubation strategies?
Yeah, I think there's as a corporate, there's a couple of things that you wanna consider, which I think we've learned in the last I would say 2 to 3 years in our engagements with corporates around the world. And I think yeah, maybe just run through a couple of important ones. One which is very important is the idea of top management ownership, because if you have top management ownership, it automatically becomes a high visibility topic in that organization. You will see some top talent kind of spinning towards that new incubation initiative. You will get the right funding, but maybe most importantly, you will be able to do things which are maybe disrupting or challenging one of the business segments, right? As soon as you go onto the business division level, you tend to get into political discussions, and you tend to get into discussions where people try to kind of fight for their own territory. And you don't want that, right? You want the best solution, you want the best solution for the company, so you need to have some top management ownership. I think that's very, very important. You need to throw in good people into the game. I think what's very important is there need to be good people attached to this project. You need to allocate a couple of really talented people. You need to allocate a really talented, maybe young top manager that's kind of leading this initiative. I think that's very important. And I think from the cases where it didn't work out, it was kind of this little weird thing that's coming up, and no one was really taking care. I mean, the best people were still allocated into very, very different fields of the business. So even if it's just one top shot, but allocate good people to the business. Otherwise, you don't show you're serious about it. I think that's important. Then there's a classic one, I think, which you know pretty well too. Willingness to adjust your business, willingness to potentially pivot, willingness to fail. And I think you're going to learn as you go, and I think you've got to be very flexible in the way that you run this. So you will have steering, you will have decision gates, but I think within these, you have to have a lot of flexibility in terms of learning from the last 6 to 12 months and then adjusting accordingly and being fast in adjusting, right? You want to act similar to a startup, so you have to be willing to adjust, and you have to be willing to fail. I think that's very important. And what I mentioned in the beginning is the mid to long-term plan. It does not work within 2 years. It doesn't work within 3 years. You can be lucky to have a good shot, but in the end, plan this for 5 to 8 years, and plan to see the biggest impact into your organization after 7 to 8 years, and plant this as a seed for the future, and stick to it. I think that's very important.
Great. I love those 4 points. It really shows that there is actually preparation people can do and should do before embarking on a incubation strategy. I definitely see overlap here with the work the Academy is doing in terms of preparing some of those key people. But 7 to 8 years to get ROI. How do you find top management accepting that?
It's a classic issue. It's an issue why companies decide to go off the public markets to focus on the real business and not have the pressure of shareholders. I just saw the recent interview which came out this July with the CEO of Google, Larry and Brin, basically, where they also say, I think if they would change one major thing, it's about midterm planning and having an idea and then sticking to it for a number of years. And they mentioned their big initiatives around the driverless car, and they mentioned their initiative around Google Maps and their initiatives in Google X in general. I think every of the new businesses they spin out, and they told us, I mean, no matter how many smart people you put on it, and even if you invest a couple of million, the impact comes after a number of years. And now look at the ones. Driverless cars, when did they start? 10 years ago. Maps, 10, 12 years ago. So it does take some time until you really see a big impact. So I think you'll see smaller impacts already along the way, but I think until this becomes a really big, impactful piece of your business, it will take some time. It will take some time.
It's interesting, especially for those public companies, because they then do come under pressure to produce results. So one of my lines of thinking has been, I wonder if private companies will be faster to adopt this long-term vision on innovation, especially those private companies that are still being run by the founder. Have you seen there any correlation maybe? I don't know if you only deal with listed companies,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
do you find that the entrepreneur of a smaller company is maybe more motivated for the long-term vision and willing to take that risk?
Absolutely. I mean, there's also a market what that private equity is very active in. I think if you have a smaller company, if it's a founder-owned company, you can just do way more with the company. You can radically change things. You can steer easier, and that's what the financial markets also believe to some extent. If you look at Dell, that is also taking off the public markets now, and they can do things they can't do when they're public, right? And that's why they do it. They can completely transform the organization and then go live again with a different portfolio. But I strongly believe it is easier for companies that are not public. Nevertheless, you can still do things within large corporates as well. It's just sometimes you have to sometimes work around certain processes and certain regulations.
Okay, interesting. So Daniel, I think you've given us some really good hands-on advice here for what needs to happen before and during incubation. Maybe let's talk a little bit about what happens after incubation. In our kind of structure is the third phase in the process. After incubation, normally you're then involved in really launching and growing the idea or the new business, whatever it is, before you can then scale it in the final phase. What sort of things do we need to be careful of when, I guess, reintegrating projects back into the corporate after they are coming out of that incubation phase where they've been looked after and nurtured and protected?
Yeah. So this can be a very tricky one, and also there we have a number of examples of companies. I think what's very important, if you can somehow do it, is you wanna keep the management that has been involved in incorporating the idea. You want that same management taking over and scaling it within the large organization. I think that's very important. There might be a point when the business becomes just very large and you need a different skill set, so you don't need the growth CEO or founder, but someone who is maybe more managing risk or managing an international portfolio. So there might be a point, like in a classic startup, where you actually need someone else. But I think the biggest failure is in the handover process between the idea incubation and then the planting of that incubation idea basically into the large corporate. And you can't just throw that on the other side of the fence and tell them, hey guys, please take over now. You need to have people who are emotionally connected, who are motivated to work on this, who have drive. In a perfect case, that has been the guy who even had that initial idea and was either came in from the outside or was a guy who was kind of discovered through an internal ideation process. And I think you need that connection of a founder to his idea. And that drive is super important for the first couple of years of the business. So let's say you incubate it for 1 or 2 years and then you hand it over. That's too early. You need that person to come in there, to be the visionary, to be the salesperson, to be the driver, to even make it successful within a large corporate. And then I think once that has been the case, at a certain point, you could think about making it a line function. But that shouldn't be too early. That should be after a while.
Okay, very good. We found as well through our work at the Founder Institute how important passion is in order to make entrepreneurship successful. So I think that's definitely a key factor. What about rewards? Because if you're doing these kinds of projects, you're not working 8 hours a day, are you? So how do you motivate that person that they stay passionate about this and that they decide to still pursue this idea within the company rather than leaving the company and trying by themselves on the outside?
Yeah. So I do think you need a certain equity option that is very attractive. I mean, every company can structure it in a different way, but in the end, you need to have a strong upside potential. I think that's very, very important. I mean, that's the way that private markets work. That's the way startup ecosystems in general work. It's basically a natural selection process, and that person has to figure out if this works out, I'm going to have a benefit as well. I think that's very, very important. And yeah, you see people testing virtual stock options. You see people giving real stock options. You see people giving stock options within the corporate, people giving stock options within that little startup. But I think it's very important to give these founders a reasonable amount of equity stake in the company. Otherwise, it's just not attractive.
Yeah, I think that's crucial as well, but a lot of the feedback I've received from corporates is that's a pain in the ass to implement and organize. Is it really that difficult, or is it just about having the right process in place to execute on that?
We're in the middle of these discussions as well, and it's a new process. It's something new. Yeah, you got to have lawyers looking at it. You have to look into certain policies. It's definitely some work, but I think if you want to do it the right way, you can do it. And obviously, you will see some people that might have trouble with it because if a startup succeeds, the founder might earn more than some of the top managers in a corporation. But in the end, I think that's just what you have to go through, and that will focus enough talent and energy on these launches and startups. I mean, that's the best thing you can have. If one of your startups in a corporate incubator is highly successful, the CEO is rewarded, the company will have a huge benefit as well. And I think that's what you want. You don't want classic old corporate structures, but you want models that work. And so in the end, I think, yeah, there's some work to be done. Yeah, you got to pay some legal fees. But in the end, it's not impossible. It's more like a resistance to change, right, which we see always in large companies. And this is a new thing. There's a new process. You need new funding, new budgets, new owners. And that's just naturally causes pain. And that's, I think, why some corporates complain about it.
Okay, so just accept it's a new way of working, and therefore we need new incentive schemes, new processes, etc. Maybe you can give us a little insight quickly. At what stage would those incentive processes come into effect? I think it doesn't make sense at the very beginning, right, when it's just ideas flying around everywhere. At what point do you think it makes sense to sit down with the employee, the potential driver of the project, the original startup team, and kind of make them that promise that, hey guys, if this is successful, you're going to be benefiting from a significant upside?
Yeah. I think this can be all over the place. I guess there's some very good founders who also try to manage their stock holdings right from the beginning, right? If you just look at people, I think some will be just about the idea and let's get this up and running, and some start very early discussing what they would like to see. So I guess you need to have an idea at a very early stage. My feeling would be, let's maybe just pick a team that was assembled inside of a corporate incubator. They've been developing the idea for, let's say, about 3 to 6 months. They've done a first prototype. They have a good idea about the potential business model. And what you could do then is basically try to negotiate it right after they've gone through the first kind of incubation course. I think you have experience there as well, but I think you have to have a tangible idea about this is the product which reached product market fit, and this is a potential business model. And I think then after 3 to 6 months you could start discussing it. That would be my guess. It shouldn't be too late because you want to have expectations in a row. But I think after 3 to 6 months could be a good time.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Probably I would even say after 3 months, with the way our incubation process is going. But probably they should know that this option exists before they come into the incubation phase. So they know this is what they're working towards if they're successful in the first 3 months.
Yeah, and I would make it dependent on the maturity of the startup. I mean, you see this all over the place. Sometimes you get teams who already have a product, right? They just worked on it before. It was a little hobby on the side. It was maybe a project within the corporate, and they just want to take it private for now to accelerate it. So sometimes you see different maturity stages, and I think you can just say if someone has a proven business model and even has the first success in the market and has something out there, you could discuss that right from the beginning. So I think I would leave that flexibility up because there might be a couple of teams that are well prepared and have a product, but I mean, the incubator is there to find people who are motivated and want to build something. So I guess 70% maybe might be, as you mentioned, worth to discuss after three months of an incubation process in-house.
Yeah. Do you think this could be an interesting tool for HR to use, almost company-wide, in terms of almost like a campaign internally? Say, hey, if you think you're entrepreneurial, you think you have good ideas, or have you been working on something outside of office hours maybe, where the company has execution skills to bring it to market? here's this campaign, we've got this offer that if you go through the first 3 months of incubation successfully, we'll make you the CEO of that product, for example. Could that help with different employees' career paths, or translate their careers into entrepreneurial careers?
I would argue absolutely, yeah, and you see it now in companies who are fairly innovative. Not to mention Google again, but I think they do this as well. So there is a path. If you want to kind of be more entrepreneurial, you can do that, and you can get equity in that idea and build it and scale it. And so I think in the end, you will always, in a large corporate, have very, very different managers with very different goals and skill sets. And I think you will have a certain amount of young and hungry people that want to do something, have an impact. And I think if you don't give them the right vehicles and tools, they might eventually leave, right? So I think having such a career path, which definitely has higher risks, but higher rewards, is very attractive to a certain percentage of your workforce. And I feel that companies will start addressing that, especially once you see now the first models that work and the first successful cases that come out. I think then you'll see most likely a larger wave of adoption.
Okay. So Daniel, let's bring this to a close. I mean, if there are people out there listening to this and they've heard incubation, and that's why they're watching this this video, because it is such a hot topic right now, what would be your departing advice for people to consider before getting involved with incubation?
So absolutely, I think what you should do, and I think that's what many companies do today, is get your kind of sensors out there and figure out what could be a potential model that works for you. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but I think start some little initiatives and learn. The budgets you're going to spend are a fraction of what you spend in your core business today, and the potential impact is pretty large. So definitely, I think, wrap your head around it and start with something very small to figure out what can be applicable for you. As you mentioned before, it can be products, it can be retaining talent, it can be tweaking and imputing the way that you run your future HR. And so there's a number of different potential impact factors, but get out there now and try it in a lean way. And I think that's definitely something that every management team of a large corporate should be starting to do.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much. Wish you all the best with future clients, and we'll have your email up at the end of the video so people can get in contact with you directly as well if they maybe have more questions or want to understand more about what Detecon is doing. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jan. Talk to you soon.